My name is Drew Friedrich. I'm from IBM. I run the Solutions Department within the Federal Analytics Group. And today we're talking about a subject which I don't want to say is near and dear to my heart, but very relevant and something which is getting worse and worse all the time. That is fraud, specifically fraud in the federal government. And what we want to talk about today is using technology, using tradecraft, using institutional intelligence, not to react to fraud, but to prevent and preempt it from ever occurring in the first place. So we have a distinguished panel with us here today. I'm going to read their names because if I read their bios, I'm going to be here for 15 minutes, and that isn't a good thing. So we're going to start off with Johan Boss-Beyer. Johan, if you could stand up real quick. Johan is, as he says, been kicking around for a long time. He's the Director of Analytics Services for GSA. Johan, can you say a few words about yourself real quick?
Sure. My present position actually is involved with most of the agencies. I'm sure most of you know GSA, but I'm in the administrator's office, so I'm working extensively with agencies to implement or enhance or improve their particular analytics and data management programs. I came from the private sector originally and also worked at education and HHS, a number of other agencies. So I'm sort of the helping hand to pull the parts together.
Great, thanks, Johan. Next, we've got Tony Trankel. Tony is a beleaguered Baltimore Ravens fan.
Right.
And the Chief Information Health Officer for IBM Global Health. Tony, a few words.
Thank you, Drew. Good morning, everybody. I'm Tony Trankel, as Drew said. I'm with IBM's Global Health Unit. Been with IBM a couple of years. Before that, I worked a number of years at CMS, SSA, GSA, and other assorted places. So I've been around the block like Johan has been. Sometimes we've been on the same block.
Yeah, exactly.
Super great. Thanks, Tony. Now we've got Mike Mashburn. Mike is actually a Rams fan. There was almost a fight back in the green room between these two guys. So Mike is the Director of Data Analytics, Office of Inspector General for the U.S. Post Office. A few words.
Hello, everyone. Good to see some familiar faces out there. I'm a career Fed. I began my career. I spent 16 years at the Census Bureau tracking the economic side of the house. They don't just track people, they also track the economy of the United States. And at the Census Bureau, I was put in a specialized area that tracks government spending, specifically federal spending. So when President Obama was elected, I was put on the task force to work on recovery.gov and federalspending.gov, which was the portal to collect the federal spending information and then to display it to the American public. While at the Recovery Board, I was recruited by the IG of the Postal Service to come work in his analytics shop over there, and that's currently where I am, my position as director.
Great, super, thanks, Mike. And finally, Alex Habershon. So Alex is the program coordinator at the World Bank Group's International Corruption Hunters Alliance. I love that. Designing training programs and special research. A few words.
Good morning, and thank you very much for the invitation. When I tell people I work at the World Bank, they usually say, oh, you're an economist. No, when I say I work in the bank's integrity vice presidency, that's where I work as program coordinator, the response is, so you're a lawyer. Well, no, I'm not that either, though I am surrounded by lawyers and former prosecutors and investigators and forensic auditors and prevention specialists. I am none of those things. I am what the bank usually describes as a governance specialist. I came into the bank, I started working for the bank 15 years ago as a social scientist in public sector reform, in focusing on justice sector institutions. And from there, it was a fairly natural progression to start working with accountability institutions. And then when the World Bank started to really engage in a very forthright way with corruption risks, to start working squarely on corruption, which is how I ended up in the integrity vice presidency, and where working on data has also been an inevitable evolution. I think everyone in the room will understand that this is something that is inevitable, and we need to catch up with the tide and stay on top of it. So one thing that I've learned working in data, and I've been working with colleagues, and a couple of them are in the room with me today, is the vital importance of events such as these, learning from other institutions, so that we don't all reinvent the wheel or invent the wheel in our own little wheelhouse and learn from each other. Although the problems that we're trying to solve, and the World Bank does have different problems than what the US government may be working on, and we talk a lot with counterparts in Inspector General offices and things like that, a lot of the solutions that we're going to develop are going to be very, very similar, hence the importance of conversations like these. So thank you very much for the invitation. Delighted to be here.
Super great. All right, now we're just going to dive right into it, okay? So my first question is for Tony, all right? So Tony, the question is, what programs are most often exploited with fraud? Now, how can these vulnerabilities be addressed with technology? And I think this is the interesting part. How can humans address these vulnerabilities in ways that technology can't?
Oh, thank you, Drew.
Yeah,
Throwing
no
out the tough one for me.
That's right.
He's a Patriots guy, that's why he's picking on me. You know, I think in terms of fraud, I think it's a lot of different places in the government, but the benefits programs, certainly the health programs are ones that have been ripe with fraud for many years. At CMS, at Medicare, they estimated between 5 and 10% of all Medicare spending is fraud related. In the Medicaid area, almost 6%. So you look at that, and over the years, you know, certain patterns have evolved, certain types of ways of looking at how do we begin to deal with some of this. And technology comes in a very important way. You can deal with it in a couple different ways. One is up front, when you put in edits and other types of checks that prevent it from happening in the first place or stopping fraudulent payments before they happen. And CMS and other agencies have done a lot with that. The other way is to actually look at it after it's occurred, begin to look at patterns and develop models that you can utilize to begin to really see when anomalies occur. And it's an iterative process that works. And over the years, I think a number of agencies have come a long way in it. CMS is the agency I'm closest to, as well as SSA, because I worked in both those places. But what CMS has done over the past several years is really focused on how we can bring some tools together to really stop this. And one is screening the providers, the other is working in the claims area. But there is a human side as well. And in the human side, I think, and my colleagues can certainly address this too, but I think it's a human side both within the agency and also with the beneficiaries. So at CMS, they've had something they work with called the Senior Medicare Patrol. And what these are is volunteers who actually get trained and go out and work with beneficiaries to look at other anomalies on your Medicare summary notices, prevent identity theft, things of that sort. So there's an education thing. And then from a CMS perspective, the human part is how do you form data governance so that you can really begin to look at how the data comes in, what's the quality of the data, how is it tied across different types of siloed data warehouses within the agency, so you can begin to look at ways your policies, procedures, and other ones can be improved to help as well. Because a lot of fraud, a lot of problems is due to data that comes in. So I'll stop here and let my colleagues jump in as well.
Sure. I'd like to echo Tony on, with healthcare being a very lucrative area for finding fraud. Specifically in our group, we look at these claims coming from the Postal Service. You can imagine, you know, a lot of carriers, there's slip and falls or within the plant accidents that can occur. And it happens exactly as Tony described. Is we started off, or the program started off by looking at past cases that were actually true, and they did happen in the real world, and then they were able to take that data and look backwards in time as to build the model as to, okay, if we now apply what we see going backwards from convicted cases to data that's moving forward, you can begin to see a pattern. And then where the human interaction comes in is our group's responsible for generating leads and possible fraud, but we kick that over to our investigators. And then it's the investigators' purview to decide whether or not with the investigation and surveillance and whatnot, if there is actually fraud being committed. And by doing that, we're also able to help the model grow through false leads, false positives, validation to check on.
I would add to that too. I'm sure everybody in the room is familiar with student loans and grants, and there are certainly a lot of grants and loan programs across the federal spectrum. And that's also an area where inherently fraud is part of an operational integrity issue. And so many times you hear the terms fraud, waste, and abuse, and distinguishing between those is usually very hard Sometimes somebody willfully is doing something. Other times just administrative incompetence or lack of resources or an anomaly within a system is creating something that looks like fraud and isn't. I would advocate very strongly for the human element before the technology, because many times in the agencies and personnel that I'm working with, they've done something from a technology perspective. You know, I bought the software and I'm thinking it's going to solve my problems. It's going to tell me intuitively where the fraud is. Or I've done something from a technological standpoint. I merged all those multiple data sources together. How come it's not giving me the answers? And 90% of the time, it's the human that has the gut instinct, that has the behavioral reference, right? That understands what another human being might do to take advantage of a program. I think that's very critical, and not to lose sight of that too. The technology definitely enhances that capability and certainly ramps up in large programs the capability of identifying and rapidly targeting and preventing fraud. But more times than not, there's the pay and chase model. And so we're moving more and more towards the prevention model using human interaction. And to Tony's point too, that I think is very valid, is going out to somebody who may benefit from a program to see how they were taken advantage of. What happened? You know, why did they suddenly get in a fraud scheme when they didn't have any malfeasant intent, but they were suddenly stuck? They've now committed fraud in a program, and that wasn't their motivation. So I would strongly advocate that there's a human element in everything you do, analytics and the data component as well.
Alex?
Yeah, I'll definitely echo that point, that we're beginning to use data analytics, and we're doing it with the understanding that it's only going to narrow the field. We work at the World Bank both on prevention and investigation for the purposes of sanctioning firms that have engaged in sanctionable practices. And data analytics, we understand, is not going to find those practices, but it is going to narrow the field significantly, which is where the human element comes in. And you know, seasoned investigators will look at the findings and take the case further. It might just be helpful for me just to say a few words about what it is that we do, because it is different from the concerns that US government agencies have. So as a development organization, the World Bank provides funding for development programs in 172 countries. And the objective of those programs, very broadly speaking, and the mission of the World Bank, is to eliminate extreme poverty and boost shared prosperity. We know that corruption is a drain on development. We know that it hurts our projects. We look at fraud and corruption and other sanctionable practices, which is also where we differ from government agencies that are focused on fraud, waste, and abuse. But the similarities are very, very striking as well. Our main data points, if you like, the main areas of risk have to do with procurement. So we look at suppliers, we look at projects, the data points associated with projects, and with contracts. And data analytics can help us, we believe, and we are beginning to get results in this area, to significantly reduce the field in which we need to look. It's a massive amount of data that we need to sift through, and traditionally we've focused on complaints and allegations as a way of driving our anti-corruption and anti-fraud efforts. In order to be more proactive, as you heard from the GAO, data analytics can help pinpoint areas of risk. And this is where human intelligence also informs the way that we operate. We know from experience where risk is more likely to happen. And given that data analytics can't be built in a day, we can focus our data analytics projects in areas of highest risk. So areas of procurement areas and infrastructure where we know that there may be a lot of fraud and corruption happening there. That's where we might direct one of our pilot projects. And here's another potentially useful lesson about data analytics is that if you select beforehand where you want to engage strategically, working in increments is the way to go. Working with small data sets, we're talking about big data here today, but in effect, what we're doing at the World Bank is very small data. We're choosing data sets to work experimentally with, and we're developing machine learning techniques which can help us be more predictive, and we can talk more about that if there's any interest in doing that. But really to work incrementally, pick your sectors based on where you know the risks to be, and use the data analytics to help focus and target your investigations.
Great, super. Actually, that's a good lead into our next question, Alex. So we all know data is important, but data quality tends to be a real issue. Not just data quality, but data ambiguity. data fabrication. How big a obstacle is that to fighting fraud? And frankly, what are we doing? What new are we doing to basically overcome that hurdle?
Do you want me to have a crack at that?
Yes, you're first. Yes.
Okay. All right. Data quality is definitely a problem. As I said, we work with different types of data. So it may be World Bank proprietary data, which could be called big data in a certain sense. We also work a lot with open data. So procurement data is increasingly open, as is the bank's data. And that can be data from all around the world. It can be at the regional level or at the national level. Data quality is a huge problem, which is either to do with data entry errors, or the systems themselves are not very conducive to access and analytics through data tools. They may be not structured data sets. They may not be available through APIs. We may be looking at PDF forms that are very unworkable for anyone who's tried to to work with large data sets. That is one issue. One very, very large problem, which we know from our own experience and from working with partners in other governments. So whether these be procurement authorities in other governments or, for example, the agency that handles procurement for the European Union, what we're calling entity resolution or name ambiguity or entity ambiguity is the first bottleneck that we need to get through in order to do any big data analytics. To work with very large data sets, you need to know that you can rely on your ability to identify names and entities properly in those data sets. So it may be that, and one example that, I'm not supposed to name names, but for example, IBM, we have IBM on the panel. A data system will recognize IBM. It may recognize international business machines, but if you try to automate that, a human being can make that distinction, but getting a machine to do that, and this is a very obvious example, the machine needs to be trained in order to do that. So entity resolution is something that we're working on with academic partners, and we're relying very heavily on academic partners, actually, and sort of data scientists from around the world. And we're going to develop a tool that should be open source that we can share with other partners. So this will be an important output for us before we can even engage on any larger sort of big data analytics.
Yeah, I know the cultural name ambiguity is a real problem, given the multiple variations and different tribal pronunciations and all of that. So I know that's a real issue. Guys, any other thoughts on that? Johan?
Actually, I would say that the data ambiguity and disparity is actually a fraud enabler. Because of that, there are fraudsters, and think for the sort of the landscape of fraud. It might be contractual fraud. It might be beneficiary fraud. It may be inherent fraud within a policy or program. So people that are managing the program are actually conducting the fraud. We have that as well. So that we have to prosecute people within the government that are actually creating fraudulent scenarios and redirecting funds. So think of the benefit of if I don't know where it is and there's ambiguity, so I can't really match and compare adequately, and there's no adequate sharing mechanism. And I'm not talking about uniformity of data, but just a mechanism where people feel comfortable of sharing the data. That's an open door and enabler to fraudsters. And I think the reality is sometimes when I train people in a fraud environment, I'm dealing with human beings and training them. I've talked more about don't be an analyst, be a fraudster. Role play for a moment. So, it's behavior and drama, if you will. So, put on your amateur theatrical cap for a moment and think of what you might do if you were going to create a fraud scheme. And then reverse this and apply it to what you have now. And invariably, the answers I get is, oh my goodness, the data is actually driving my ability to run that scenario. That's the script for my show. Great, as long as that stays ambiguous and disparate, I have an open door to not be found out, right? So if one party doesn't know about the other party, or if there's ambiguity between those sources, guess what? I'm hidden because of what you didn't do. And that's, again, the majority of the cases that I see. You see how much of that is human element. It's not necessarily the technology that's solving that. But again, to have that analysis and that perspective, then move over towards the technology, which enables you, as Alex said, to fine-tune it and actually start to target. You can actually create models out of that as well. But definitely that's an enabler. I can't emphasize that enough.
Yeah, I think No, I look at it as quality, timeliness, and completeness, because I think all of them are factors in fraud. So from a timeliness standpoint and if you look at Medicaid data, 57% of OIG said 57% of Medicaid fraud is due to eligibility issues. So somebody moves from one state to another but still gets benefits from both states. When I looked at the data we had coming in at CMS, a lot of the issues around providers, they may have phony addresses. So if no one's checking that, someone can set up a phony storefront and create all kinds of fraud issues. At SSA, there's problems with the Numident, which is the database that information when you go for your Social Security number. Prior to 1984, they had enumeration at birth, but prior to that, people would go into the Social Security office and get a card. And so there's a lot of government databases out there with data that's poor from a quality standpoint, poor from a timeliness standpoint, poor from a completeness standpoint, because often data that comes in for one reason is then repurposed for another reason. And if you're trying to figure out, like a claims data has certain amounts of data on it, but if you're trying to get information related to fraud prevention, you may want additional information that's not on that claim when it comes in.
Yeah, I'd say in my career, both at the Census Bureau, at the Recovery Board, even now at Postal Services, I'm learning their systems. The standards should be very much paid attention to, because what I'm running into is if I try, and my analysts try to combine multiple data sets that, let's just say something as simple as a state. It might be a different attribute, a different format. Zip codes with leading zeros, you can't match those up. So we had a case at one point where we were looking at federal spending across the counties, and we had several counties that got no federal spending, and that just could not be true. So again, the human element came in as we investigated. It turned out that one programmer had made the zip code a numeric field. So it dropped the leading zeros. So when we were doing the matching between appropriations, spending, and outlays, they didn't sync up, they fell off. So you got counties with no money, which actually wasn't the case, thank goodness. Also recently, we did a quick little, I call it exploratory analysis, where we got a data set of indemnity claims. That's where if somebody mails a package and it doesn't arrive, they can put in an insurance claim. And just taking a sample of the data, 30% of the addresses that it said the packages were going to was not even a legitimate address. So,
Lovely.
so that right there, we're ramped up to take that a little.
Okay, we're going to keep on moving on. They say time flies when you're having fun, and I'm having a blast, but we want to leave some time for questions. So what I'm going to ask the panelist is, I'll direct the question to one person, and if someone wants to add some color after that, just zip right through it, okay? So Johan, where does your agency focus the majority of its efforts in actually preventing fraud before it occurs? So the preemption aspect, all right? Identifying fraudulent activity in real time, or catching it after the fact and attempting to recover fraudulent payments?
Actually, I'll answer that two ways. General Services Administration really has two channels, as I'm sure many of you know. There's a contracting area, the acquisition expertise, and there's facilities. So most of the buildings that you can see outside the window here belong to GSA. It's an enormous real estate portfolio. Believe it or not, both of them have rampant fraud opportunities. And we do it two ways. First of all, we have certainly segments within GSA that take a look at the contracting provisions to make certain there's compliance follow-up. There's rigor behind that from a programmatic standpoint. We have a very proactive Inspector General who is looking at that type of contractual or facilities fraud. Facilities fraud can take a range of tacks too, where people are utilizing the facility inappropriately or they're not compliant. And obviously on the contracting side, what you contracted for versus what you do is different. I would switch gears, though, and answer this in a second way. In the role that we've defined within my office and the people that I'm working with is we're actually an enabler to help agencies, and particularly law enforcement or intelligence community, to start establishing models and methods that work effectively to prevent the fraud. So part of my job is to go out and sit with an Inspector General sit with those people that are doing program oversight and show them where it's been successful previously. What type of data lends itself to fraud? What type of processes? What type of sequence of events? We mentioned earlier, too, something within a policy where the data, I think Tony's mentioned this, where the data is being captured for one reason and being repurposed for another.
Right.
That many times is the accidental fraud enabler. So sometimes coming in as a third party to sit with an agency and say, you know, your old loan program regulations gathered the data to just track how many students and how many people were benefiting from the program. Your new regulations are looking at something totally different. The data is being repurposed and you're not actually able to see the fraud when it happened. Have you thought about changing policy? Have you thought about changing the way you're managing the program? And so that's the good part of my job is that's a very positive dialogue when you actually can start to show people what to look for in the data stream, in a pattern of activity, in the way they're managing a policy or regulation. So that's very much what GSA is doing, both on the helping hand and then also in our own portfolio.
So I think in the health side, it's traditionally been pay and chase because you've got a huge operation like Medicare with billions of claims a year, and it's important to keep the money flowing. You know, for a long time it was we would pay and then we would chase it later. Over the past number of years, I'd say the past 5-6 years, that model's begun to change, and what you've tried to do is not only screen providers, as I mentioned, but now all the Part A and B claims at CMS, A is hospital and B is physician, they go through edits before they go any further. So there's a system at CMS now called the Fraud Prevention System. It actually goes through an entire pre-edit process when the claims come in to get adjudicated. So I think you know, you're starting to see the shift over the years from a very much a reactive mode to a more predictive and prospective mode.
I would say from our standpoint, it's still technically pay and chase, even though there is a predictive aspect to it. But if you think about someone who's on the rolls collecting workman's compensation, if you can catch them within the first month or so of committing the fraud when they shouldn't be on workman's compensation, you can save years and years for your agency on collecting that money. So we look at future costs. So it's not necessarily that we're catching them before they actually commit the fraud, but we're catching them a lot sooner.
Right.
2 quick points. I mean, one about where to focus resources, and the other
Right.
one about sort of the emergence of predictive tools. I think the good news with data analytics is that you can use it for both preventative and enforcement purposes. The key thing is to have specialists from those different disciplines in the room when you're designing the project, because you're using the same sort of tools but for very, very different purposes. And we're discovering that actually it's relevant for everyone in our office and the different responsibilities that they have. I've seen a progression in our own data work and listening to other partners from this concern. We've gone from our ability to handle poor quality data and focusing on improving standards, and now increasingly to this question of prediction and predictive analytics. We're experimenting with this with some initial success for the purposes of detection and investigation and ultimately enforcement. And the way that we're doing this is with our understanding and the modeling that we've already done about what risk looks like and the features that are associated with risk associated with suppliers and contracts and projects. And some academic data partners have helped us develop a model. I'm not a data scientist, so I might misuse the language here, but by using substantiated cases, proven cases of fraud and corruption and other sanctionable offenses, in order to train the data set to recognize across massive sets of data and identify potential instances that look like substantiated cases. So that's one way of creating a flagging system where you can say, this supplier, this procurement process, looks a lot like, has the features that are identical to cases that have been substantiated. Maybe you should focus your attention there. So that's one aspect of predictive analytics that isn't telling us this is going to happen for sure, but focus your attentions here, focus your resources here, because it's more likely to be happening here.
Super, great. Mike, can you share any success stories around this stuff that your agency might have, or any of you guys?
Sure. So if you want to talk about big data, the Postal Service has thousands of data systems out there with multiple tables in various environments. If you think about how mail flows through the system, we've recently developed what we call tripwires, where we can pinpoint where this is for mail theft, so we can pinpoint where exactly in the process the mail theft is happening. And then the agents go out, again, to investigate and make sure that it is actually happening. And we just had one particular case, which I thought was fairly colorful, and I asked if it was okay to share, where there was a suspected carrier who was basically, he wasn't stealing the mail, but he was dumping it. So he wasn't, he was not.
Kind of like Newman in Seinfeld.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
That's exactly what it was like, except I don't think this last part pertained to Newman, at least I didn't see the episode. When the agent went to serve the warrant and investigate this guy, he actually discovered a marijuana grow farm within the agent's house.
Yes.
So
Wow.
that was a fairly interesting
That's a great story.
case. Yeah.
All right, super. Stacy keeps on signaling me over here, so do we have time for one more question, or?
One more question and audience question?
That's fine. Okay, if we've got audience questions, great. All right. Finally, let me see here. Tony, how would you prioritize your budget with respect to fraud detection capabilities? And have you been able to quantify success of your past agency's effort to combat fraud and reduce improper payments?
Well, I think a lot of it depends on Congress, how much they're willing to appropriate for you. To be fair, CMS has done very well in getting money appropriated, and CMS has then gone and turned that into some actual benefits where they've shown actual, millions of dollars of savings.
Yep.
They've gotten rid of some bad providers who did not meet the criteria. They've done certain things that have demonstrated success, but in the government, as we all know, a lot of it is around avoidance, and sometimes avoidance doesn't sound real good to OMB or to Congress. They're looking, what did you actually save? So I think a number of agencies, like SSA, where I also worked, they do continuing disability reviews. They do reviews on SSI payments, and a lot of that comes out of discretionary funds. So SSA's standard was, if we get this much money, we'll do this many disability reviews and do this many redeterminations on SSI payments. I don't think that's necessary. It's okay for the agency because they have limited funding, but for running programs that involve billions of dollars of payments where you can make millions and hundreds of millions of dollars of potential savings, you need to have a steady source of funding. CMS has been fortunate, a lot of agencies haven't, and I think if you look at the programs in the agencies, a lot of them are directly dependent on how well they've been able to do with Congress and OMB.
Great, guys. Any quick follow-ups on that?
Yeah, I would say to you too, again, I have a landscape of seeing, I think at the moment, 49, 50 agencies that I'm working with directly. And in those cases, this is going to sound simple, but it's not, is being able to tell the story, whether it's to somebody on the Hill or a budget officer or an executive that is being asked for a substantial amount of money. There needs to be sort of the journey story of here's where we were before because of what we're doing now. We're mitigating some activity, we're preventing some activity, and it literally tells people a story, because if you say big data and analytics, people get pinwheels very quickly, and they sort of look like, yeah, that's the latest term like cloud computing or something else, I'm not interested. But if you can tell a story that now impacts budget, and I've seen this happen, where here's what we were doing before, and we were restricted because we were just using worksheets, we had 2 people, this was collateral duties that they really weren't responsible for. I've actually seen budgets grow where they were actually cut back, especially in the IG's world, and credit to them for the work that they do, because they've had situations where you're not showing enough returns, so we're going to cut your budget back, but by having one of those stories and a success story, they not only got their budget back, but it grew substantially over the next year or 2. So again, It may sound simple to do, but how to articulate a simple story of here's the fraudster, here's what they would have gotten away with before, here's what we're doing now, here's how that benefits the citizens and taxpayers, that resonates to multiple audiences. It does to me, because that's my tax money. So I would say that, and I've seen that embedded in the budget process as well.
All right, Mike or Alex? All right, beautiful.
We're looking
Okay,
at
good.
your
We'll take some
timer.
questions from the audience now. Oh, come on, don't be shy.
We stunned you that much?
So, Michael, what percentage of the 30,000 unemployment compensators, that's probably the bad word, at Postal Service, do you think are probably fraudulent? And do you guys do the investigation, or is that done by the inspection service?
So I think the actual percent is very low, but when you have, over 500, 600,000 employees, that number could, I don't have an exact percent for you, but it actually is very low in comparison. So the IG that I work for, we have purview over internal. So for the actual employees, we would investigate. If it's external to the Postal Service, like porch theft of packages, that would be inspection service. Safety outside the organization, that would be the inspection service.
Anything else? Ah, right there, that gentleman.
With the difficulty,
I'm so sorry.
speaking of difficulty, with the difficulty of cross-agency collaboration and specifically sharing data, the privacy concerns that were mentioned in our previous panel, is there any top-level group that might be working with the privacy folks at OGIS or someplace that meets regularly with the appropriate committees in Congress to perhaps change the statutes to facilitate solving some of these issues?
So everybody looks at everybody else up here.
I can tell you that I'm not in the political affairs office, or however, but the IG Act is gaining momentum in Congress, which would give IGs a certain level of purview extra than what there is right now. So for example, we've talked about in the back room about the Data Matching Act, or the Computer Matching Act, where you cannot compare two systems of record and go on a fish hunt. If you have a designated target, then you're able to do that, but you can't just combine two systems of record and say, okay, we found all these disparities. I think as part of the IG Act, and again, I'm not legal counsel here, that would be lifted for IGs to give us a little more freedom.
I can at least address it from the work that I do, again, not political. I actually chair a number of government-wide committees that are devoted to this, and that's sort of in its infancy still, of getting multiple players together at the table to talk about what is the problem plus what would the solution be. So, very recently we've seen things like the Data Act come out. We've seen more legislation start to bubble up and manifest itself as a result of that dialogue. And the dialogue does include OFPP and OMB and representative players that have a vested interest there. I think the other thing, too, is before that actually can have sort of a top, as you mentioned in your question, a top-level authority, I think that needs to be identified. What is the authority over data in government? And I think that's still an open question. Because a lot of the statutes and regulations that we're managing to, it's like the technology, come from the 20th century, some of it the early 20th century, and we're in a completely different world. So one, we have to educate people as to why that's no longer applicable. Two, we have to bring them into a forum where they're not threatened because it appears perceived that their program is in jeopardy because of the dialogue. And three, to articulate something, and again, I'll go back to the Data Act. FITARA very recently also has elements in it too, that talks about inherent exchange of data. So it's, the terminology has changed. Even our memorandums of understanding no longer talk about data transport, they talk about data exchange. And so again, I would probably even turn to an entity like the IRS that in the student loan arena is able to offset refunds with the student loan portfolio is able to verify information but cannot confirm your income. And so there's a statute there that actually prevents it. And ironically, when you apply for federal aid, you have to put down your AGI. You have to fill out all that stuff and file your tax forms. But there's no operative agreement to exchange that between entities. And so that's, again, I think it's in its infancy, but I think all the panel would agree we're at a place now where this is a compelling need. The world has changed so dramatically. There's no opportunity now for debating should we anymore. It's how. And getting people at least to the table to say we ought to be exchanging data. That's, whether it's in this field of fraud or if it's in crime or, terrorism, wherever it is, it's coming up in multiple areas.
I think we got time for one more question. Right there.
Good morning. I didn't have a question, but I did want to share an experience that might be helpful to others. I work for HUD, and we had done some program analysis to identify risk in our housing rental assistance programs, and identified a database that would be valuable to us, and we pushed for the appropriate statutory authority to gain access to a database that would help us to combat fraud in our rental assistance programs. And so, I would encourage those out there, if you're looking at your programs and doing an assessment of risks, that perhaps you can identify, a data set out there that may be beneficial to you. HUD's been very successful with it. It's been in place for about 8 years, and I can testify to the effectiveness of sharing data, but it was a database that HUD never had access to, and we said, you know what, if we had this data, it would be beneficial. And we got the statutory authority to access that database. It became part of a routine use for the other federal agency as well as our federal agency.
Super. Actually, that's a great way to close unless there's any more questions. All right, I'm going to just ask the panel real quick. Do you have any closing comments or thoughts for the folks?
Starting with Alex.
Oh, thank you very much. I would say we talk about sort of cross-government knowledge sharing, not just data sharing, but knowledge sharing and working with the private sector. Don't forget the NGO sector. Our experience has been, not even so much in the United States, but internationally, there is a tremendous amount of innovation happening in the NGO sector around the world, particularly groups that are really interested in transparency and ending impunity, fighting corruption. Some fantastic innovation, and we're starting to collect partners from this sphere and be happy to share contacts with people if they want to expand their sphere of knowledge sharing.
Super.
I'd like to touch really quickly. It's not necessarily big data, but we're all affected by it. And in my area, one problem I see with the federal government is when you get a really good person, a really high performer, they promote them to management, and then they take away their ability to actually do the work because they're supposed to manage people. That's my own personal plug. It's affecting me right now, and I also see people coming up the food chain that I'm going to lose as a...
Yeah, I have the same thing.
All right, just a couple points. One is that when you look at counter fraud measures and fraud prevention, one of the things to look at that's actually hurt the Medicare folks is the audits and appeals issue. And what has happened at CMS is they got very zealous about going after providers, bad actors, and it completely blew the appeals system. And so what happened is for a while there, they even had to slow down on investigations because of the fact they have such a huge backlog in appeals that it's really kind of curtailed a lot of their effectiveness. So one of the things to think about is, I think Alex mentioned as risk-based. I think risk-based, resource-based, and just thinking about it as a whole life cycle. And if you push on one end, what's going to be impact on another end?
Great.
And I would say to you, too, just as a closing idea, two things. There's a great deal of activity at the moment about chief data officers in government. So this is another new role that's materialized. If you have an opportunity to engage with that individual or the development of that position, it behooves you, especially from a fraud standpoint, to make certain they are aware of where the data gets in the way of effective prevention measures. And so I've seen actually a dialogue go on. If you're going to implement a program, maybe you put the fraud components at the front end of that program, and in the oversight of the data within an agency or cross data, the CDO actually can enhance that opportunity to share data, to make certain there's quality behind it, to know what the residual impacts are. And the second thing I would say to you is keep your eyes open and by all means join. This is a great forum. This is what we like to hear happening on a regular basis. There are other forums across government that allow you to get engaged with other practitioners where there's an opportunity to share success and failures so you know what to not to do and maybe share ideas too, so you don't have to start from scratch. So I would say keep your eyes and ears open about the associations in town like MeriTalk and others.
Super. That's all we got. Panelists, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.